Professor Allott, at the end of the fourth interview, we began to discuss some of the recurring themes in your published works. The last point you made was apropos the undesirability of formalizing human rights, and earlier you said you were strongly against the advocation of some superstate or universal law. I wonder if we could return to these topics, and in particular, if you could outline how you envisage governance would be practically achieved in some new world order, bearing in mind you place many of the ills of the world at the door of what are currently called nation-states.
I always get a bit nervous when I hear the word practically, because, as somebody, I think probably Hegel, said, theory is the ultimate form of practice. People, when they use the word practical, usually mean sort of pragmatic, materialist, factual things. But I certainly take that view, which obviously goes back to Plato, that it's actually ideas that make the world, and that if you manipulate ideas, try to change ideas, you're doing the most practical thing imaginable. And not unrelated to that is the thing I've said a million times, which is that it is not my job to suggest, particularly the institutional forms, that this new kind of international society would have. Because, partly for the reason I've just given, that I'm not in that business, but also because I take the view associated with the name of Edmund Burke that constitutions are evolutionary phenomena. And he took the view, when he was writing so fiercely against the French Revolution, that it was crazy to attempt to create a constitutional system rationally. You can't do it. And he thought that the French, in their sort of Enlightenment mode, were simply destroying the whole of the 1,000 years of French society and trying to create a completely new thing intelligently and rationally. And that got Edmund Burke extremely agitated, basing himself obviously on the British experience, where we've never, ever planned the British Constitution, that it has evolved. And evolution, it's almost more than metaphorical, that as challenges come down the centuries, society must respond in order to survive. So it sounds metaphorical to say evolution in the case of constitutions, but it is almost sort of factually the case. And Britain is the most perfect example of that, because we've been under threat since the Romans left in the year 410. Endless challenges. And the Constitution is the product of those. You can identify the challenge and the response. That's the sort of mega historian Arnold Toynbee analysed the whole of history as challenge and response. The whole of history he wrote about in 12 volumes, or whatever it was. And that's certainly true of British history, as challenge and response. So I take that view of the emerging international society, that actually its forms, particularly its institutional forms, will be the result of challenge and response. They will just emerge. And some of us may have in advance prejudices against certain things that we do not want. And those prejudices will be based on our experience of national societies. And over-powerful government is one of the things which has challenged us all, certainly in Europe and of course all over the world, for centuries. And democracy in itself could be seen as the response to the challenge of government that regards itself as absolute and total. And we were lucky in Britain in that we saw that earlier than any of the other European countries, with the possible exception of Holland. We saw that that was the great problem, how to stop somebody getting hold of government and regarding themselves as in total power, like Louis XIV in France. We already before Louis XIV in Britain, we told our kings to stop this nonsense. You do not rule absolutely. And the only one who got anywhere near it was Henry VIII, the founder of this college, who sort of thought that he was absolute. But of course, in the end, did one or two absolute things, such as the English Reformation, but nobody since has been able, even James I, nobody since has been able to be absolute in this country. So the development of democracy, and there again the theory of it, particularly Hobbes and Locke in the 17th century, was necessary to explain how a country governs itself without an absolute monarch. In other words, how the people can govern themselves. Was the response to the threat of absolute monarchy. And then other countries followed suit, as it were, and eventually democracy, as it now is with an enormous difficulty expanding across the world, God willing, to get rid of all these dreadful absolutist governments, of which probably there are 70% in the world, I should think, are either absolute governments in a single person or in an oligarchy, a party, like Russian Communist, Soviet Communist Party as it was, or Chinese Communist Party as it now is. So at the global level, I don't know what institutions there will be, but as I say, one has deeply based constitutional prejudices on the matter.
Globalization is another of your recurring themes, and you've said that with globalization, diplomacy has given way to collective government, and war has given way, and I quote, to the management of public world order, so that uneconomic, cultural and antisocial phenomena flow promiscuously across national frontiers. And that was your 2006 Alec Roche lecture.
Yes, globalization, therefore, is a very ambiguous phenomenon. On the one hand, it quite obviously is an emerging socialization of the world. Everybody knows that, economically, culturally, politically, and even governmentally and administratively. It's a socializing of the world. But of course the risk of it is, because it tends to therefore override national systems and national traditions, the risk of it is chaos, that it will become impossible to organize and control anything. And I've been writing about that recently, that I keep using the word autonomic, that now the world is becoming dominated by autonomic systems, that's to say systems that regulate themselves. And as we've seen in the current financial crisis, that the economic system now is really beyond control. Things just happen. And it may be happening in security now. The Middle East, very good as it is in some ways, what's happening there, nevertheless, it is a disintegration of existing horrible systems and could lead to the most terrible chaos. And world culture, which we've talked about for centuries in civilizational terms, high culture, and then, as it were, the culture of the masses, there seems now to be the possibility that the culture of the masses, popular culture, is simply taking over, and high culture is gradually declining, so that there will be, because civilization is an ordering of the mind and the spirit in our old conception of civilization. And that's not only a European conception, but a Chinese conception, Indian conception. And that ordering force of higher civilization may be disappearing. And nothing then will regulate the world. Morality will become even more relative. The Enlightenment in Europe obviously noticed that morality is extremely relative, and relative to the country, and as Montesquieu said, relative really to the climate. the moral system just depends on geography, he said. And so if morality becomes completely relative, if science takes over all progress, as it very nearly has done, and civilization disappears as a high ordering concept, and if the economy becomes completely autonomic, global economy, then that is the downside of globalization, which is extremely worrying. So one is at the moment in enormous doubt about the phenomenon of globalization. It's unstoppable, but it is terribly uncertain whether it'll go in the direction I want, which is the socializing of the world at last, or whether it'll go in the exact opposite direction, into more or less global social chaos.
If your vision of a global legal system for humankind worldwide is to be achieved, then globalization in some guise is inevitable.
Yes, it's what I've always said, and I think I may have said it before in these interviews, is that in the end what, God willing, will determine it is the consciousness of the world, and that's what I'm working on in what people call theory or philosophy. In other words, the inevitability of globalization going whichever direction can only be taken over by better ideas. And so two of my slogans that I've repeated 1 million times is a revolution in the mind, not in the streets, and the only power over power is the power of ideas. And those are really the sort of central ideas. And the power of ideas over power, let's say over public power and governmental power, we have to remind people, in my view, it's a great part of what universities are for, at least on the humanities side, to understand. It seems incredible that it should be so, but that people should be led to understand how power is organized, and how power is organized in relation to ideas that transcend it. That seems to me what university education should really be about. So all humanities subjects, in my view, are sort of departments in that project of getting intelligent young people to understand how the world is, and therefore to feel empowered in relation to it. And when we say a word about literature at the end, I will say something more about the importance of literature.
Thank you. Another of your recurring themes, Professor Allott, is with the problem of intergovernmental organisations. And we have already embarked in this country on some form of political coalescing, but you predict that the European Union is currently on the wrong track. And you argue for the establishment of a genetic European nation in your Health of Nations on page 131. What would this entail?
Well, intergovernmental organisations are a great problem because obviously they're a huge rationalising of the world. They're governments getting together across frontiers and really sort of governing rationally, in the tradition of the rational civil service, the world. And so that one, in some sense, must welcome. But of course that involves a great net increase in the power of governments, the power of the executive branch of governments. And as I was saying, the whole of our history is about, well, the central theme of it is about the problem of governmental power, how you take power over governments. And the solution we found, which was called the rule of law, which we sort of discovered as such at the beginning of the 17th century, with Francis Bacon and Edward Coke and so on. That was our first solution to it, the rule of law, that law is above governments. So we told James I, I'm terribly sorry, you're under the law. You are not the law yourself as you think you are under the law. And then the second solution was democracy, that's to say that the people should say what the law is. And that took rather a long time, even for us to achieve in this country. There was, in the 18th century, a sort of oligarchy system of government, which was better than absolute government, obviously. It was the sort of wealthiest and most pushing people in society ran the country. And then in the 19th century, we gradually extended it to everybody taking part in the government of the country, at least by choosing the government. And then through public opinion, which began really in the 18th century, where people could shout about what was going on and have an effect. So nationally, it was a struggle. So we're faced internationally now with hundreds of intergovernmental organizations regulating practically everything that the public knows nothing about. It's hardly heard of them, the public. They're not subject to national democratic processes. You know that. Just they're impossible to control from a national parliament. They're not subject to public opinion. Public opinion knows nothing about them. And then the European Union came along, which I've got to restrain myself, is really the externalization of government, executive branch government, to cover the whole of Europe, now 500 million people. And what they did was to attach to executive branch government, the European Commission and the European Council, to attach to it the European Parliament and the European Court. That's to say, something democratic and something rule of law. Because they thought, oh, well, that's very straightforward. Everybody knows that's the way democracy works. You have a strong central government, you have a parliament, and you have the rule of law. Everybody knows that's what democracy is. But unfortunately, and I've written what must be thousands of words on this point, what they sort of forgot was that only works within a society. You can't just have it, these institutions sitting there. The only reason it works in Britain or France or Germany or wherever is because there is surrounding it a great complicated society of people who think and shout and have interests and struggle. And the institutions are their servants, not their masters. That's the secret of democracy. And so these people who created the European Union, who were not the British, we rather stupidly failed to take part in the original structure. They being continentals and therefore very formalistic, and I must say, they being extremely recent converts to democracy, to put it politely, thought it was a formalistic problem. And that's never how we've seen it for half a moment in Britain. So this has led the British to be extremely unfriendly, hostile towards the European Union, which we see as a sort of absolutist pan-European government, over which we have so little control. So it is a huge problem. And so I wrote a thing called the Europe of the Mind, because the only way to solve it is to create the consciousness of a society. There again, they're aware of this problem, but they're doing stupid things like saying, oh, we must be closer to public opinion. We must issue lots of sort of explanatory statements, and we must allow parliaments to address us and look at what we're doing. And now even we must allow referendums. If 1 million Europeans want to question what we're doing, they can have a referendum. That's completely stupid. And that's not the problem. The Europe of the mind, and other people have written about this, is remembering that the more interesting part of European history is the culture of Europe. We have had in Europe for the last 3,000 years an amazing culture, which strictly speaking has been exported to the whole world. And so we've huge experience and huge amount of ideas about these problems. And these governments who've created the European Union are themselves the product of that history, but they've sort of hijacked the fact of it into the European Union. So I'm fiercely in favour of European integration. I think we should all belong together and have an identity. I mean, in addition to our national identities, but that it should be translated into a vast bureaucratic governmental machine is a nightmare. But how we get over that? So it's now 500 million people with very little power and effect in the world compared with the United States and China. It's a desperate problem, and it's almost impossible to imagine how it can be solved. Because the British, at the governmental level, hold back so much from participating fully in the system. They just do what is useful to Britain. The general public in Britain just despairs of the whole thing and doesn't want to hear anything about it. And we cannot trust Germany or France or Spain or Italy or even the Scandinavians, who are sensible people. We can't trust them to do the necessary. We've just had this fantastic fiasco of this drafting a so-called European Constitution, which was utterly ridiculous. It was sort of 500 pages of stuff in order to get closer to the people. And very sensibly it was rejected by the Dutch and the French people. And they went off and then revised it, removed the name Constitution. It's now called the Lisbon Treaty. And it's still sort of 500 pages of nonsense. And they think they've done the most wonderful thing. They think they've popularized and democratized it. So if I could just add one other point that applies to intergovernmental organizations in general. At the heart of democracy is a very tricky problem called representation, the theory of representation. And an amazing thing I discovered, I was very excited when I discovered it, is that already in the 14th century, when our parliaments began, people noticed that representation is a two-way street. It's amazing, they noticed this in the 14th century, that the people, there's an ascending form of it, where the people give authority to somebody to act in their name and on their behalf. And then, when they've acted and made the law, there's the descending aspect of it, that binds the people. And the people are only bound because they authorized it in the first place. And that sort of circle of ascending and descending representation is a very subtle thing. And it varies from year to year, from time to time. The consciousness of it and the fact of it, we've had to keep modifying it to introduce more people into the circle by extending the suffrage, by improving the newspapers and so on, so that the ascending part, we can have more effect than just putting a cross on a piece of paper. It's a terribly complicated matter. And in intergovernmental organizations, it's not clear how, if at all, the theory of representation applies. The downward side of it applies. They make hundreds of decisions and even laws in these intergovernmental bodies. But the upward side of it, the ascending, doesn't exist. And that is a condition of democracy. And it's terribly hard to get that across to people, particularly continental people, who, as I say, have terribly little experience in democracy. But already in the 14th century, people noticed that it's a bargain. We give you that authority, and then we accept what you do with it, but we keep watching you, and we may chuck you out at the next election if you don't do what we like. It's terribly complicated. And of course, in the European system, you can't chuck them out. They just go on and on and on. Obviously I could talk till the cows come home about this, but that's the essence of it.
Professor Allott, you recently spoke before an EU Sovereignty Commons Committee.
Yes.
Is there anything that...
Well, that's very similar to this problem, because I'm not sure if I mentioned before, but there is before Parliament at the moment a thing called the European Union Bill, which some of its supporters call the Rescue of Sovereignty Bill, because it's a very peculiar bill that will require governments here in Britain to get permission, either from Parliament or by referendum, to take any decision in the European Union which might extend the powers of the European Union. And they see it, the supporters of the bill, as rescuing what they call the sovereignty of Parliament. They say the sovereignty of Parliament has been damaged, if not completely negated, by membership of the European Union. British Parliament is now subordinate. European Union law is supreme even over Acts of Parliament. So they see this as a wonderful piece of rescuing the essence of the British Constitution. So I gave that evidence to the House of Commons European Community Committee, telling them that they made one tiny error, namely there is no such thing as the sovereignty of Parliament. I wrote an article on this in 1979 called Courts and Parliament, Whom. It's a mistake created by an Oxford professor called Dicey in 1870 or thereabouts. We don't have a sovereignty, an internal sovereignty in Britain. The whole point of our constitution is that the three top things are on a level. Parliament, the courts, and the executive are in a separation of powers, which of course was copied in the American Constitution of 1787. And the American Constitution of 1787 is a most brilliant expression of this idea that none of them dominates the other. The President, Congress, and the Supreme Court are in a sort of struggle on a horizontal level. So here the situation is very, very similar, because this we developed in the 17th century, and the Americans borrowed it. The courts, strictly speaking, because of the rule of law, have the last word. And that's the British court, Supreme Court here, and the European Court in Luxembourg, have the last word on the law. Parliament makes laws as it feels like, and the courts interpret and apply them. And the executive does its executive job, and in Britain sort of dominates Parliament in practice. So our problem is, so there is no such thing as the sovereignty of Parliament. Dicey made a mistake. Dicey's other fundamental principle of the British Constitution was completely brilliant, namely the rule of law. He said that that's what and he's 100% right. The rule of law is the great secret. Everything is under the law. And Parliament is under the law. Parliament's powers are those recognised by the law. It can't have any other powers. But it's so that's the theoretical problem. The other problem is that in the 20th century, the executive branch more or less took over Parliament. And people wrote books about it called The New Despotism. 3 famous books by judges, oddly enough, saying that we're getting back to the old Tudor period, Henry VIII, with the executive branch owning Parliament. You know, it has hundreds of its supporters. It has 120 junior ministers or whatever. It has another 100 who are waiting to get a job. So the whole thing is dominated by the executive branch. So that if you, these silly members of Parliament, talk about the sovereignty of Parliament, actually you're talking about the sovereignty of the executive, which seems a bit of a reversal of British history. And so I said that in a talk in the House of Lords to a thing called the All-Party Parliamentary Committee on the Constitution. And they were a bit surprised. I think they'd not heard this before. But it's sort of elementary, but they've not really heard it. So I don't know what the fate of that bill is. I think it will go through. But I haven't heard the latest. It's absolutely silly. bill, and I tell them you're 22 years too late. This is EU now is the EU, and nothing else you can do about it.
Professor Allott, still on the topic of IGOs, you're probably even more scathing about the United Nations, where you attributed, and I quote, to which you attributed an outdated atmosphere of governmental absolutism. And you said that the United Nations is one of those IGOs that multiplies like flies on rotting meat. How could such a body be redeemed in your eyes?
Well, again, the United Nations is very ambiguous because, in a sense, it is very impressive to see all 190 countries sitting there. You couldn't fail to be impressed. It's an amazing sight if you think of the whole of human history. It's a bit amazing. And I used to look around the General Assembly chamber and I thought it was astonishing. People from every corner of the world sitting there. And in fact, I used to sit and try and count the number of countries that the British hadn't ruined the history of. But that was... So in principle, it's a most marvellous thing to see. And therefore it must have a sort of civilizing influence at the global level. But of course, again, ordinary people know nothing about it. It's never reported, except when the Security Council decides something. And the civilizing influence is on the small number of diplomats who attend it. And from developing countries, very poor countries, or countries with wicked criminal regimes, who appear in beautiful suits or occasionally in beautiful tribal dress. The civilizing influence is mostly about the restaurants of New York, because they are totally unrepresentative. 80% of them totally unrepresentative in beautiful Savile Row suits, eating in the best restaurants in New York. And they feel sort of cozy together, all these governmental representatives. They all they respect each other. And they have this highfalutin idea about the United Nations, that it's sort of ultimate source of benevolence and wisdom, which of course it isn't. So I do try to think of the good things that it's done. The most interesting thing is to judge the Security Council, because the Security Council developed from the League of Nations. It's very hard to know what to make of it. Throughout the whole of the Cold War, obviously, it was completely powerless, because the East and the West could never agree on anything, and there is a veto for China and Russia and the United States in the Security Council. And then after 1989, it suddenly went into extremely active mode, the Security Council, and it developed a new problem that I think I've referred to somewhere, I hope I have, which is they suddenly thought they were sort of absolutist. And they started doing anything that came into their head, anything they could agree on. After the Iraq War, they sort of more or less said, well, let's reorganize Iraq now. And looking around the world, seeing some criminals, they said, let's create some criminal courts, international criminal courts. That would be a good idea. And at one point, and I did challenge the legal advisor of the Foreign Office on this, they stopped putting in their resolutions the key phrase that we'd always used, which is having regard to the threat to the peace, breach of the peace, or act of aggression, and exercising our powers under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, we hereby decide. They started leaving that out, not bothering to find whether there was a threat to the peace, breach of the peace, or act of aggression. They just said, we hereby decide. They've started putting it back in again, I'm glad to see. But so they suddenly, and so then international lawyers started asking, could the Security Council exceed its powers? Could it go ultra vires? And who could stop it? And that remains an open question. So the Security Council, what I call the bureaucratization of war, which is what it is. It's turning war into a bureaucratic phenomenon, which these government servants sit around deciding where they'll have a war and what they'll do about it. I suppose that's slightly better than them just going around invading each other. But it is so cynical and so falsely legalistic that it's very difficult to believe that it's... But as Mr. Churchill so rightly said, jaw is better than war. So it probably is a bit better that they are talking. But it's so alienated and so peculiar a phenomenon. And of course lots of people, including people whose views one respects, say that why don't we turn the United Nations, the General Assembly, into a parliament? Why don't we elect members of the General Assembly of the United Nations? Why don't we give the International Court sort of Supreme Court powers, not just dealing with the odd occasional dispute between states? Why don't we make it final court of appeal for the world, some people say. And so there is a tendency, because the Americans, when they, at the beginning of the 20th century, when they were keen on these international bodies, which of course Americans are not now keen on, they were really trying to extrapolate the American Constitution. The International Court of Justice, the former permanent court, was consciously an attempt to extrapolate the US Supreme Court. The Americans suggested it to the world. And so they've always been tempted, because the Americans are very fond of the American Constitution, they've been tempted to go along the extrapolation route. Why don't we just extrapolate things that work nationally into the international arena? Well, as I was saying just before, that I'm afraid is far too simplistic a solution. You can't do that, and particularly because of this problem of society. It's got to be a society on whose behalf government works, and a society which constantly controls government, formally through elections and informally through public opinion. You've got to have that, otherwise you get a massive accumulation of total global power, as I was saying a moment ago. So I can't think of any way to reform the United Nations, really, because it is an absolute mirror image of the current organisation of the world, which is... and I wrote an article once saying that all these people who float around among intergovernmental organisations, or who run them, are really a new aristocracy. The world is run by a sort of aristocracy of all these people with rather large salaries and large pensions, who float around all these conferences and pass resolutions and make declarations and so on. And it's a jolly nice life. But it's a bit like the 18th century, really. It's sort of, a sort of ruling class of a very small and unrepresentative sort who run the world. It's a sort of corrupt, illegitimate aristocracy that runs the world. And I mean, good luck to them. It's a very nice life. A five-star hotel life is very nice, particularly if you come from a poor country.
You've also been critical of the International Law Commission, specifically referring to reconstituting international law, which the UN purports to achieve. You said in your Health of Nations that it is the unreality of the Academy with the unreality of traditional diplomacy, and you classed the ILC in very colourful language in your Alec Roche lecture as an in-house council to the mob of all mobs.
Yes, well, I didn't think I could improve on that. Really. No, the ILC is, which is not a very significant body at all, but is symptomatic and symbolic. The idea that you can make law out of the top of your head for the whole world, rationally, is ridiculous. Law has to emerge from clashes of interest and loud voices and people struggling some intelligent input, obviously, in the law. But the idea that people can sit in Geneva, I don't know how many there are now, 60, 25, 35, however many they are now, these charming people, and emit law, even if it then has to be adopted by governments to take effect, to me is completely ridiculous. And I mean, if it keeps them happy and they're staying in a nice hotel, it's fine. It doesn't do any harm. As far as I know, it doesn't do any harm. But no, it's terrible. And it is so symptomatic of a misunderstanding of what law is and what society is and what the world needs. So I was very rude about it, but of course it goes on. It hasn't stopped.
You've also been critical of legal institutions which have a global reach, and here I'm thinking of traditional and current diplomacy and foreign policy. I quote again, you said, "I regard the phrase international relations as a hallmark of the corrupt old order in eunomia." And you also said that in the beginning of your preface that it was your experience of 13 years in the Foreign Office that led you to write it and to work for a new order.
Yes, international relations is a bugbear really for me, the phrase. Partly because it is a summary in 2 words of the existing state of affairs, obviously, which is interstate in character. But there are 2 big problems about it. One is that the international part of the phrase, that I see the whole system as vertical in character, from the village up to the world. And the idea that there is an international realm separate from the national realm is for me the source of all the troubles. It can't be right, because that means that people are tempted in the international realm to think they're living in a different world, constitutionally and democratically and morally, all the rest of it politically. And it could be international in another sense, that it is genuinely all the nations of the world seen together. But in its present form, it means that, a horizontal world between states, over and above and apart from a national world below it. And that, to me, is terrible, because that's the source of all the problems we've just been talking about. But secondly, a more bizarre objection is to the word relations, because I get terribly agitated when I see, as it constantly, the newspapers and academic articles and so on saying, relations between France and Germany are now in a poor state. And in the old days, they used to say the relations between the Wilhelmstrasse and the Ballplatz are in a poor state, meaning the foreign offices. It's unbelievable. They treated it all as if they were persons. This week, France is friendly with Germany. And of course, a few weeks later, they have a war and kill 100 million people. It is so agitating because it allows them to personalize it all. And as Foreign Office people have always said, it means that politicians love summits, because they go along and feel like ancient kings representing all their people. And they sign something, some ridiculous piece of paper. And they all sign, and then they have a glass of champagne, and they think they've improved the world. It's incredible. So that personalizing of the so-called relations between states, it's not only a sort of objection to the rhetoric of it, it's an objection to how the people involved see it. They see it as the relations between, Philip II and Holy Roman Emperor or something. That's how they see it. And diplomats, senior diplomats, used to see themselves as a sort of repersonification of their king. That's why there were so often very high aristocrats. Ambassadors and foreign ministers were very, very senior aristocrats because they should behave as if they were a king. And so I've got very agitated about it because international relations has taken on a third meaning in America. They, being pragmatists and realists, believe that that is the way you should analyse the world, academically, philosophically, theoretically. And it is a great field of academic study in America called international relations. And it feeds into and encourages this totally pragmatic view of the world, that the world is just a struggle of power. International relations is a system of power. And all you've got to do is A, maximize your power, and B, use it as effectively as possible. In this country it's called international studies, which is a bit better. I once gave a plenary address at the British International Studies Association. I told them that your discipline should not exist. It is dreadful. You shouldn't be studying it. There were about 400 people there. I couldn't believe all these hundreds of people, lots of young people, studying all this dreadful stuff. But it goes on, and there's still hundreds of people, I believe. And in America there are hundreds and hundreds of people and dozens of think tanks. So they, in my view, support the system. There are one or two who are creative and critical. There's a very good man I've been close to at the University of Aberystwyth, who is the H. Carr Professor of International Studies there, Ken Booth, who I've been close to. And he's now just retired, but he very much was going in the same direction as me. And he at one time was president, I think, of the British International Studies Association. But he was going in a similar line, that I'm sorry, we've just got to change the whole thing. And he's just produced a vast book on that subject. So there are people, and I'm hoping there now will be young people who see that this is all ridiculous. We just have to be much more imaginative. Imagine a completely new system. We don't have to accept all this stuff. They often wear three-piece suits, these people, because they think it's a very serious upmarket activity, foreign policy. I think the words foreign policy should be abolished. I think diplomacy should be abolished. It should all be an extension of national activity. There shouldn't be a separate thing called foreign policy. There should be just British politics in general, which obviously has to deal with everything all over the world. But the idea that there is a thing called foreign policy, which very few people know about, is terrible. Similarly, diplomacy. It's now gone too far the other way, and diplomats are extremely lowly classed. Their governments are very cruel now. Diplomats are extremely important people. But governments have sort of turned against them, as Mrs. Thatcher did, and some American presidents have, saying they just go to cocktail parties and don't do a useful job. But diplomacy redefined, as the everyday bridge between the national political system and the global political system is obviously vital activity. But that should be reimagined, diplomacy, into something extremely important.
Do you think you would have come to these views had you not spent the first part of your career in the Foreign Office?
No, I think I would not, or at least I wouldn't have dared to have them. Because, as I said, from about the age of 16 onwards, having been brought up in the war, I knew it was all bad and ridiculous, the whole system. But being that time in the Foreign Office and having done quite a lot then and been involved in a lot of different things, I think has given me the courage to be so rude about it all.
And it certainly has been the mould into which your career has been set.
Exactly, yes, that it is a continuity. I was just thinking the other day, if we're getting towards a conclusion, are we getting towards a conclusion?
We
Just say if there's anything else we should mention before.
I hope we can talk about your views on international law and lawyers in general. I mean, you've described in your delightful Roche lecture, you say that international lawyers will gladly advise the international lunatics.
Yes, I gave a talk in Wisconsin called Ontology and Deontology of government lawyers. And I think it is quite an interesting question whether they have a duty, a deontology to, be involved in changing the system, because international lawyers, both in public service and in private practice, obviously have to accept the system. You can't go along and say to your client or your government, oh, it's all ridiculous, you shouldn't be doing this. But I think there is a sense in which they're obviously propping up the system, they're giving it prestige, and forgive me if I've quoted something that Sir Robert Jennings said once to me when I expressed doubts about the International Court. He said that, well, you may not think they're very interesting, our decisions, but they do stop wars. And that's quite useful, he said. And of course my response to that, I don't think I gave it at the time, is I'm afraid that's not enough. And again, forgive me if I've said it before, but when the Luxembourg Prime Minister came and said the EU exists to stop wars, that's ridiculous. We've got to have higher ambitions than that. So it's a big problem about international lawyers, because there have to be international lawyers, and now that international law is so vast and so complicated and so specialised, there have to be many, many, many more international lawyers, both in governments and in private practice. But it is a problem, and so all one can hope to do is to just marginally change their consciousness. And obviously that's what I've been trying to do. And of course they tend to leave Cambridge saying, oh, well, we know what you said about the system, and we'll do our best. And of course then, once they're in the middle of it, there's practically nothing they can do. So I don't spend much time with international lawyers. I used to go to the American Society annual meeting, but that distressed me so much and also it's extremely expensive, so I stopped going. But there are hundreds of international lawyers, particularly international lawyers in private practice, exuding money, because of course they tend to be terribly rich, given that their clients are either governments or huge corporations. So that used to upset me, and they obviously regarded one as totally mad. But they regarded one as mad, as again I've said before, but as somebody who actually does have some experience of what they're being mad about. And that has helped enormously for me, I must honestly admit.
Professor Allott, you asked how much more there was to cover, and really in terms of your recurring concerns, all that I hope we could do is talk a little bit about the international courts. You disparage the ICJ, which you say consecrates the old international law, while the International Criminal Court you describe as a crude extrapolation of the most primitive, morally dubious of systems for socializing human beings. And I wonder if you have any views on the alternatives.
Well, the International Court, the International Criminal Court, again is a problem. I mean, an ambiguous problem. Because, of course, we all want to stop these criminals who, we've allowed them to go on, not only for centuries, but particularly for the last 50 years we've allowed these criminal governments to go on. But the great problem is categorizing it as crime is a problem. I would much prefer that it just should be left as a political, moral problem. And in this latest novel I'm suggesting, and forgive me if I mentioned this before, but the idea that we should just stop treating them properly. We should redefine the international law on recognition and just withdraw recognition from these places, as we've now just done really with Mr. Gaddafi. The world is sort of saying to Mr. Gaddafi, I'm terribly sorry, it's finished. We can no longer accept you as a sensible leader of Libya. And I'm very pleased with that, because that's what I think we should do. We should just say to all these people, you've been stealing the people's property for 30 years. That's finished. Please go to Monte Carlo or wherever you want to go. We will take all your assets that you've stolen. And that's that. I'm very unhappy, as I was about the Nuremberg Tribunal, about turning it into crime. I think, A, that lowers it, turns it into yet another bit of legality, legalism. And B, the problem is that nationally the criminal law is so problematic. It is so unfair and so dubious, criminal law. I think I may have mentioned I did once publicly defend the proposition that the criminal law is a crime nationally. Terribly primitive thing that we've inherited. I'm very pleased the present Minister of Justice in this country is saying that prisons are just a ridiculous waste of money. They are. It's just mad. At the expense, which is greater than the expense of sending a child to Eton College per annum, keeping criminals. It's ridiculous. No, we've got to have, and I've got a former student who's gone into what I think is called relational justice, where you try and, by making criminals meet their victims, because we've got, as Jeremy Bentham says, we've got to discriminate among all sorts of crimes. And Bentham so rightly said, the criminal law is a system of prices for bad behaviour. We ought to price bad behaviour in a million different ways. And white-collar criminals, it ought to be made sure that they're not rich again, somehow, but just locking them away in Surrey or something ridiculous. And people who go around murdering people, that is obviously some psychosocial or psychological problem. So I'm against the criminal law because it just lumps together a million different forms of human behaviour. And a lot of it is wickedly unjust when it targets extremely disadvantaged members of society just to please the middle classes. Ridiculous, terrible. So those are the reasons I was against the International Criminal Court, and I went and lectured there. I went there to tell them that they shouldn't exist. I'm not sure if I told this story before. It was so funny because in Geneva, I was going along in the car, they were taking me to the meeting, and I had my notes in front of me. And then somebody said in the car that, oh, we had Marty Koskaniemi 2 weeks ago, and he said we shouldn't exist. And I thought, oh my God, I can't say the same thing as him. So I put aside my talk and told them that you're doing an educational job, really. The criminal side of what you do doesn't matter. You're doing an educational job, trying to educate people to be against all these dreadful things. And secondly, you should be giving a model of ideal criminal law procedure to the world. Perfect, because most of the criminal law systems of the world procedurally are terrible. So you should be giving a perfect example of how fair criminal justice should occur. And so I did sort of in passing say that they shouldn't exist as a court. But so I was trying to take an upbeat view, because they might get a bit depressed if academics keep coming along and saying they shouldn't exist. So I felt quite strongly about the ICC, I must say, and I've been a bit justified. I don't really think it's been much of a success. And it does seem quite unfair that I don't know if it's all the cases are against African rulers, but most of them seem to be, but the Yugoslav tribunal is separate, but most of the ones in the ICC seem to have been against African rulers, which doesn't seem to be quite right.
Professor Allott, if we can now try and draw some general conclusions from this too brief survey of some of your concerns, what might be your solutions to, this is a big question I know, but to remedy the state we find ourselves in? Do you envisage some sort of global organisation of the great and the good as you expound in Invisible Power 2?
No, well, obviously I've thought endlessly about this because I've been challenged endlessly by people saying, oh, that's all very well, but what are you going to do about it? And I think, obviously, of national examples of how, insofar as we have improved nationally, how we've improved. And obviously it's something to do with expanding the thinking classes in society, which is what happened. And I think Aristotle was right that in the end everything depends on the middle class, because the middle class have an interest in the system working. So one very good analysis of the whole of British constitutional history is really the history of the middle class, particularly the merchants in London and the small landowners in the country wanted a system that works, wanted good law and good government. And so the rise of the middle classes in the world, there's now a middle class developing in China, a huge middle class in India, there's a huge middle class, rather, I won't say that, middle class in Brazil. So the rise of the middle class across the world gives me great hope. And even in those North African and Middle Eastern countries, it seems, I don't know how true it is, but it seems that these young people who are protesting are relatively well educated. So they are a sort of middle class in waiting, I think, in those countries. And the middle class are very tough people within the history of social evolution. They're utterly demanding people. And they're well educated enough to know what's going on, what the game is, and what the game played by people of power is. So I'm very hopeful that the middle classes of the world will just sort of naturally say this is all ridiculous. It's terribly destructive, it's terribly unfair what's going on, and it's not the best that we can do, which is what they said nationally. They said all these ridiculous institutions are ridiculous, we should reform them. They said nationally. So I'm hopeful, and what the novels are about is about more or less that nice people will see that it's almost impossible to change anything, as it's very difficult to change anything nationally. But they will get together. And in the latest one of the characters is kidnapped by the Davos people, because the Davos people, as you know, are all the most powerful people of the world, governmental and economic, sitting in Davos, congratulating each other. And they're saying, oh, isn't the world dreadful and problematic, but aren't we good people doing a wonderful job? So I thought it was symbolic if one of my characters gets hijacked by the Davos people, and God willing, I haven't yet got to it, he will convert some of them and say, you're fabulously rich people. Why don't you do something? So that's my only hope, to be quite honest, and which is why I've written these novels, that will happen. But they've got to be terribly clever. And they can't do it by keeping founding civil society organizations, as they're called, with good intentions, making the world. There are hundreds of them, good intention NGOs at the moment, hopeless, because they all cancel each other out and governments don't care tuppence about them. So to change it at all, you've got to be extremely clever. And so this is what the idea is, that these people will insinuate themselves into all these systems and just get people to realize that we could be doing better. So that's the only thing I have when people say, well, what can you do about it? What can you do about it? The rise of the global middle class and the coming to consciousness of intelligent people are really my only hope.
So your novels do actually present the key to your scholarly writings. In other words, Professor Allott, how your ideas are to be brought into effect. For example, that love is the binding force of the universe and is to be harnessed in some way. It's page 129 in Invisible Power 2. Is this how, and I quote, you can change society fundamentally by changing its theory, its idea of itself?
Yes, well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I should have mentioned before that obviously a failure of the existing system is that it's not using the whole of the human being. Because these fictitious entities called states and governments have come into existence, they are like sort of mad monsters wandering around. And human beings remain human beings. And human beings, apart from obvious exceptions, are very nice, sensible, loving people who particularly want the best for their family. That's the ultimate wish of most people. The best for their family. Either their descending family or their siblings or whoever, people close to them, they want the best. And so if you suddenly see that this whole vast so-called international system sort of excludes the humanness of human beings. You know, humanity has these, in Latin, has these two meanings. Humanity is the species, and humanity is a virtue of being humane and human. And for me, that was a sort of revelation. I suddenly realized, and you can almost, sitting in the UN, you can suddenly realize that all the human part of human beings is not present in the room. Except that they're thinking of the next meal in the beautiful restaurant. That's very human, but the good side of human beings is not represented. So that, and love, in however you perceive it, love in sort of an ideal platonic sense, but love in the human sense, is rather a relevant part of people's lives. And that is a sort of giving and sharing concept, and a respecting and dignifying concept, love, which would be rather nice to have as a sort of global phenomenon, wouldn't it? So that humanity as a whole would become human or humane. That would be rather nice.
But you cannot anticipate that it will spontaneously arise.
Well, it's what they call coming to consciousness. It's all sitting there, in my view. All these better ideas and better feelings are sitting there. They've all been suppressed, or in Freudian terms, repressed by the system. And this is not only global, nationally too. National societies are not achieving their best, obviously. And people are beginning to talk about that. Even this government, it seems incredible, is beginning to talk about happiness. And the French government is talking about happiness. How do we measure it? How do we create it? And it's sort of, for me, completely laughable, the idea of government telling us how to be happy. It sort of sounds definitely Orwellian, but it's what people are now talking about. When we've got all the refrigerators and the cars and video thises and video that's, we still don't seem to be happy. So it's still a national problem. It's a human problem. You know, why is humanity not achieving all that it could, given the incredible power of the human being? So slightly more hopeful on that, and as I say, it's the coming to consciousness. I'm trying to remember the German word for it, but it's coming to consciousness of what is sitting there, waiting to fill our minds.
Things must be solved by human realising.
Yes, they're just realising that we're quite a clever species, but we're also quite a nice species in some respect as well. We can do better. That's really, we're a self-perfecting, we have the capacity, that's a word I've used a million times, that we're capable of self-perfecting. Seems amazing. And I've just written in this latest book that it seems incredible that evolution has given this capacity to the human race to be self-perfecting, when all we are is something that's evolved out of the primeval sludge. Seems amazing. Out of the primeval sludge has become a peculiar creature which is capable of self-perfecting. Seems incredible. But if I could just summarise a thing that occurred to me recently, my career as a whole, that it seemed to me, and I've now forgotten what it is, that that first 13 years was looking at the world. The next 15 years were thinking about the world. And I think the last period since I've retired is about trying to speak to the world, it seems to me. And needless to say, none of that was planned. I'd love to think that at the age of 16 I said, I tell you what, I'll go and look at the world for 13 years and then think about it for 15 years and then try and speak to the world thereafter. Certainly never occurred to me. But if you were post hoc rationalising it, that's what it would be. And the sort of sad thing is that obviously James Crawford once said, "You'll be famous when you're dead." And I said to him, that's not much of a consolation. But I mean, there could be a fourth period when something does change. But I suppose I won't be around to see that. And it's rather annoying, unless, heaven knows, you never know what after-death experiences there may be, but probably I'll be not around to see it. But that would be the logic of the whole shooting match, the whole thing. I told myself with huge post-hoc rationalisation.
Professor Allott, could we complete the personal influences in your life, or shall we defer this to...
Well, no, I mean, I think it'd be a good idea if we could finish this time. And
you devote Eunomia, the second edition, to your mother, Health of Nations to your brother Roderick, and the Towards the International Rule of Law to your father. This suggests that they were great influences to your life and your thinking.
Yes, well, to go right back to the beginning of our discussions, obviously the whole of what one is and what one does is determined by one's origin, one's family origin. And as I said then, right at the beginning, my choice of parents and siblings was rather a good one. So I was terribly lucky. It's the thing you do in old age. You become more and more grateful for what they did and what they gave, and for what one has gained from one's siblings, one's own family. And if you're the last child in a family of 9 children, you feel even more fortuitous your existence than probably anyone else. But on the other hand, you feel sort of a greater responsibility to do something, given that you're the chance of your being here on Earth is so infinitesimal. It's infinitesimal for absolutely everybody, but in the case of a very large child in a very large family, it's infinitely infinitesimal. So I think I've always felt a sort of responsibility to do something, and I think probably that has kept one going.
Did your Catholic upbringing influence your career and perhaps your proposed solutions?
Well, again, I think, as I said at the very beginning, that it's very difficult to say what the role Catholicism have played in all this project. On the one hand, my take on Catholicism is very special. So it's not the Roman Church as such that I'm representing. But as I think I said, what Catholic Christianity does is obviously to give you an innate sense of the universal and the transcendental. You know, it's just part of one's basic structure of one's mind. But also, because it's a religion, it sort of imposes duties on you. And the duties in the case of the Catholic Church are sort of quite powerful. It makes you, I suppose all religions do in a sense, but it makes you conscious that every moment matters and every moment you're responsible for. But whether there is the third element that, and so the universalism is also the universalism of the Church, as it extends to all peoples in principle everywhere. So that may have had an effect. One belongs to an institution which is old, has been carrying on for 2,000 years, and also which is, oddly enough, claims to be universal or aims to be universal. But whether in the third thing, namely that anything specifically within Catholicism, I don't really think so. I think it's those attitudes of mind, fundamental structures of mind, and the social teaching of the Church. As I said in that talk I gave in the Vatican, is not terribly influential for me. As somewhat of a conservative, regard it as a social democrat sort of thing, the social teaching of the Church, what I would call a liberal thing, and I'm very against liberals because they are, as Lenin was against reformists, and Marx was against reformists, reform socialists, because they tend to accept the system as it is and just want to improve it and be nice about it. And I'm much more revolutionary in character. I don't accept the system. And I think we should be quite unnice about it, which was the position of Marx and Lenin. And they regarded reform socialists as their worst enemies, not conservatives, but reform socialists. And I similarly regard liberals and the social democrats as my main enemy, because they accept the system and just want to make some nice improvements to it. And that is, in my view, a very, very bad project.
Professor Allott, before we conclude, could you tell me something about the literary influences in your life?
Oh yes, that's an interesting point, because as I say, I think higher education is about, sort of discovering the world and discovering how the world is represented, which is quite arbitrary. The world could be represented in a million ways, but it has been represented through the different cultures of the world in particular ways. And so all the forms of culture, all the forms of art in particular, for me are immensely important, because they are, and I think that oddly enough underestimated. All art forms, the visual arts, literature, music and so on, are all forms of representation of the world done by the human mind at its most intelligent and most creative. And so they must be of huge interest. And in literature, people have tried to do an incredibly difficult thing, which is to represent the human world, human beings, in this way, in an original, creative, intelligent way. And that is what you recognize when you recognize great art. You suddenly see this. And then you may call it beautiful, because that means it resonates with some ultimate order in your mind as the spectator. And you say, my gosh, that's beautiful, isn't that wonderful? About a book or a painting. So that's a terribly important, deep moment. That's the mind at its most intelligent, being acknowledged by the mind at its most intelligent and most universal. So important novelists like Thomas Mann, and his whole life, like Proust and Goethe and these other people, I've studied them till I'm almost sick of the sight of them, or Dante. The Dante or Goethe or Thomas Mann or Proust, or all the great people, or the Greek tragedians, they at the limit have tried to represent the human problem, and fabulously difficult to do. And one can be critical of them. The Greek tragedians, obviously, were in a class of their own, brilliant beyond belief. Dante was in a class of his own, universalizing the human condition in Aristotelian and Christian terms. Brilliant. Goethe is more of a problem. Thomas Mann is more of a problem. Proust is more of a problem. And the reason they're more of a problem is that they're representing life, or Flaubert or Balzac, or these people who've represented human life in great detail. One can have a less comfortable relationship. One recognizes how clever it is. But I suppose one, or the greatest of all, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, but you recognize that it's not quite how I would have done it, or I don't think that's quite right. And Thomas Mann is such an interesting example. Dostoevsky also, they were so conscious of what they were doing. They knew that this was their problem. And I suppose Proust, perhaps above all, he knew that his novel is about a novel. Proust's novel is really about writing a novel. Well, as many people have said, it's about Proust writing about somebody who's writing a novel, asking what is it that a novel is. And Thomas Mann spent his life struggling, and I dislike his novels quite a lot. But I think, obviously, they're immensely respectable. You've got to respect them. And he consciously, in his notebooks and in his correspondence, worried, is this too didactic? Is it too philosophical? Will anybody read all this stuff? And for me, The Magic Mountain is the absolute limit, which is supposedly a philosophical novel. But for me, it's almost unreadable. And so in writing my novels, my humble little novels, I've been trying to discover how you do it without putting people off. Because it's quite a thing to ask people to read Buddenbrooks or Magic Mountain or the whole of Proust. It's a lot to ask. So these little novels are very little. And then I took the view that Thomas Mann had a great theoretical, philosophical program in his novels, which people have written hundreds of books about, and which you don't really get when you're reading them, unless you're incredibly clever. So that's why I put the notes separately, so as not to have to wait for academic writers to say what is in this stuff. But if the reader wants, the reader doesn't have to, but if the reader wants, they can discover what I was thinking when I was putting this stuff down. So again, I mean, all novels, I can't remember who said it, are an experiment of a very important kind. All works of art are an experiment. How you represent beauty, how you represent truth. And so I have spent a lot of my life, in a way, non-academic, non-legal life, on this problem of, and therefore art is important because it elevates, therefore, enlightens the people who read them, whatever they get from them. And just one final point, somebody very kindly lent me discs of the whole of Proust, read very well by somebody in English, but it had the enormous disadvantage that he left out all the Proustian bits, that's to say page after page after page of thoughtful discussion. And so it became just a sort of series of love stories, which were very nice. I mean, it was a very nice novel, but it wasn't the whole point of Proust, which was trying to discover a new way of representing humanity to human beings. So that confirmed me in my view that this is just an experiment. And a final point, I was just reading a very interesting thing by Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist, got the Nobel Prize, and he wrote about writing novels. And he said, there's no rule about writing novels. You just write anything. And he said the one thing you mustn't do is show any interest in the author. That is of no interest to anybody, whether Proust drank tea or drank coffee, is of no interest to anybody. And so Milan Kundera has never said anything about his private life and doesn't want anybody to write his biography. He said, I put out these books. They're very peculiar. But that's what they are. They're just interesting experiments. And there's no set form for a novel. Don Quixote is not in any set form. Tristram Shandy is not in any set form. It's completely mad. And I was so glad to read that. And my novel is just another attempt, another experiment, to see whether you could get across ideas, but sort of insinuate them into people's minds. And then if they're interested, they can look what the source of the ideas is. They don't have to.
Well, Professor Allott, thank you so much for these absolutely fascinating series of interviews, uplifting as well as very interesting. I've so enjoyed listening to your views and reading some of your work. I'm inspired by your mission, and I'm looking forward very much to the third novel in your trilogy, as I'm sure many are.
Well, I'm looking forward to it too, I can't tell you. But it's been very good and noble and kind of you to listen, and I'm grateful, because for me it's quite interesting to be forced to say these things. Is quite interesting, which I have not said in quite this form, obviously, before.